Let me welcome New Deal leader, Montgomery County Councilmember Will Jawando, Ashley Allison, the National Coalitions Director for the Biden-Harris campaign, and actor and Biden surrogate Jason George. I want to welcome you all and thank you for being with us. I'm going to start with you, Will. Will, you are a local elected official and a New Deal leader. Prior to running for office, you worked in the Obama White House in the Office of Public Engagement in the Department of Education, as well as on Capitol Hill. And you've been a longtime advocate for social justice and closing the achievement gap. So let me just start by asking you, kind of, what are your thoughts about this moment and how hopeful are you that we can bring real change?
Well, thank you, Debbie, and to all my fellow New Deal leaders and to Jason and Ashley. It's great to be with you. You know, how you encapsulate it is exactly right. We need to have this moment turn into a movement. When you think about the 401 years since Black people first touched the shores of this country in 1619, and the process of chattel slavery that, in order to be successful, necessitated the dehumanization of every part of being Black: our skin, our hair, our nose, our shape, in order to treat people as property and to abuse and rape and mutilate them for hundreds of years. And then after that, enter another 100+ years of formal discrimination by law from the state. So I think people forget that for 85% of the time, if you take 1619 to 1965, the last major civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, 85% of that time, Black people in this country were either chattel slavery, owned, or they were legally discriminated against by the state. You don't just unpack that in one day or one moment. That's why we need a movement. And so I am hopeful that this is the time, and that Joe Biden, I know from working with Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, and Senator Harris, that the opportunity exists for this to happen. When you think about what happened to George Floyd, the knee on his neck for 9 minutes while he called for his mother, while he said he couldn't breathe, you cannot not connect the dehumanization of chattel slavery in that 401+ years to that moment, because you can't think that person is human to do that to somebody. And that's, again, a form of systemic state-sponsored violence and police violence. But we have to be honest. If you look at racism and systemic racism, we die in many ways, whether it's in hospitals because doctors don't think we're sick. You look at the case of Serena Williams, and studies have shown this. She had to beg for the test that saved her life. With all her money and all her privilege, she had to beg for it because the doctor didn't believe she was sick, and that bears out in studies. If you look at COVID deaths, of course, 1 in 4 of the residents in my county, similar to the rest of the country, 1 in 4 of the people who've died from COVID are Black. If you look at who dies as pedestrians in our roadways, Black and brown residents in my county make up 75% of those killed by pedestrian fatalities. That's because we were redlined and forced to live in communities that were disinvested in, and we don't have walkways and stoplights and red light cameras and crosswalks and bike lanes, the things that we see in wealthier, whiter communities. You look at police violence, where 1 in 3 African Americans will spend time in jail. 1 in 2 African American men, by the time they turn 23, will spend time in jail or be arrested, rather. You look at 1 in 1,000 African American men that will fall victim to being killed at the hands of the police. We die in many ways. Environmental degradation, asthma, highest rates in the Black community and Latino community, because we're forced to live in areas, again, related to redlining and systemic racism. So our quality of life is directly impacted by racism. But the good news is that Joe Biden gets that. Kamala Harris get that. And they know we have to untangle this 401-year legacy that is the American story. It's just as American as apple pie, I say. I passed a resolution in this county, and you're seeing this around the country, declaring racism a public health emergency, because you must treat these outcomes as an emergency. You must have a plan of action in every area to disentangle and address them over time. And that's what Joe Biden will do. That's what us as local leaders and New Deal leaders must do. We must take this moment. We must take this energy in the memory of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and Tamir Rice and so many others. And we must turn this moment into a movement. So I know we can do it. And I appreciate you allowing me to share with you today.
Thanks so much, Will. It's so powerful and such a great way to start off about just the historic importance of where we are. I'd like to turn to Ashley Allison, and what we'll do is we'll hear from each of you first up, and then hopefully we'll have time to come back and ask a question of each of you. But let me welcome and introduce Ashley. Again, Ashley is the National Coalitions Director for the Biden-Harris campaign, to which she brings more than a decade of outreach, community organizing, and campaign experience. She was Executive Vice President at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and also served in the Obama administration under Valerie Jarrett, where her primary policy focus was criminal justice and police reform. So Ashley, welcome again. First, a huge congratulations on last night. It was such an incredible evening. And addressing systemic racism was a significant and really powerful part of the program. So I'd just like to ask you, how important are these issues to the fundamental message of the campaign?
You know, I joined the Biden campaign 3 days after George Floyd was killed. And the heaviness in my heart, the frustration that yet again another Black body was taken from us unnecessarily, was present front of mind for myself, but so many people across this country. The reason why I was able to stay committed to the campaign is because we addressed it head on. We continue to make it a center point of our policy rollouts and thought processes and outreach that honestly we do to folks. The Vice President is acutely aware of the challenges that many communities of color, many marginalized communities face every day, and is committed to, when elected on November 3rd, after doing all the work we need to do for the next 77 days, to govern in January, starting in January for 4 years, to ensure that we undo the systemic racism that has plagued our country from its inception. I pride myself as a civil rights activist, and I will go back to my civil rights activism after this campaign. But I also think one way you can tell, not just that the campaign, the Biden-Harris campaign now is committed to addressing issues of systemic racism, but it's also in who the Vice President picked to be his running mate, Senator Kamala Harris, making history yet again. The first time was running with the first Black president, and now making history by selecting the first Black female and Indian American woman to be on the ticket. It is historic. I will tell you, I did not, when you're on campaigns, you just keep your head down and you go, go, go. You rarely get time to feel the feels and all the emotions, but I will tell you, when the news came to me, I was not expecting my reaction, but I was overwhelmed with joy because representation matters. The Vice President has always been committed to that. His selection to Kamala Harris is indicative of that, and the policies that he continues to roll out say that. So systemic racism is something we continue to address as a campaign, and most importantly, he will address as the next president of the United States.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And again, we'll come back. I've got some follow-up questions for you, particularly about the historic vice presidential pick. But let's bring Jason into this conversation. So great to have you, Jason. People on this call likely know you from your roles on TV, including Station 19 and Grey's Anatomy, and movies like Barbershop, Breaking In, and Playing for Keeps. They may not know that you've also been a longtime activist in social justice and diversity issues, including, as I understand, serving on the SAG-AFTRA's National Diversity Advisory Committee. So you have made a decision to use your platform to support Joe Biden and talk about racial and social inequities in our country. And I guess just kind of two questions. What prompted you to join the Biden campaign and to spend your time on this? And what have you learned from talking about these topics around the country and how they're going to play in this critical election?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to Will and Ashley for really teeing things up beautifully. Look, I've always been involved just because my mother was a union leader where I grew up. My mother was a teacher. She taught learning disabled kids in middle school, and she was the president of the teachers union where I grew up, which is now a right to work state, Virginia. I'm sitting here drinking my tea from my Virginia mug, my alma mater. And I grew up knowing a lot of people who were on both sides of the aisle because Virginia's an extremely purple state. But so my mother rammed home in me the idea that you fight for what's right. You fight you fight for solutions, not just for the sake of winning. And I think that for me is one of the big divides in this election. So, you know, I mean, the first campaign I was ever involved with was Doug Wilder, the first Black governor of Virginia. And that was a historic win and a phenomenal moment in my life. And I, you know, began to realize that actually hitting the streets and actually using your vote and actually having the conversations with friends and family makes a difference, moves the change, gets people to believe, well, that's not possible. We've never had a Black governor before, so we're never going to have one. Cut to decades later in my life, people having the conversation, well, we never had a Black president before, it's never going to happen. I mean, I have memorized rap lyrics telling me that it's never going to happen. And it happened. And my children were alive to see it. My children grew up pretty much only knowing Barack Obama as the president. All presidents must be, that's a normal thing to have a Black president. And then for the last 4 years, they've realized that that's not the case. And just how wrong things can go when you have someone who is far more interested in winning for themselves and for their side than in actually solving the problems that plague us as individuals and as a nation. So that's part of the reason why I get involved, because I feel like, you know, and this dovetails into your other question about the platform that I have. I just was raised, but it's also become even more clear to me as social media, as we have a 24-hour news cycle, and social media has given everybody a platform. Every human being who has a phone in their pocket or has access to a computer has some kind of a platform where their voice is magnified. I happen to show up on TV, so that's more magnified. And sometimes I get the question, well, you're on TV, so why should I listen to what you have to say? I said, you shouldn't listen to what I have to say any more than you listen to anybody else. It can just reach more people. What you should be listening to is, do I make sense? Do the people that you are voting for make sense? Don't just vote for them because they're on your side, quote unquote. Vote for them because what they say makes sense and they're about something that you can believe in. So the technology's put us in that space now where everybody has a platform. And I think we've also begun to realize with that, you know, sitting now in a COVID-19 shutdown, that we all have a very real duty and responsibility to each other as a community. It's easy to say when you're talking about a very small community. Here in my neighborhood, we walk around with masks on and nod each other and put our masks up when we're close to each other to make sure we know I'm looking out for you too. I'm trying to make sure if I have something, I don't want you to have it. I want to take care of you. And that's happening on a national level now because of this technology. It comes with a lot of problems, but the best part of it is that we're realizing that we can have this conversation nationally. So it's we're moving. And then again, the COVID-19 shutdown, we're all forced to be strapped down and our eyes pried open as we look on social media, we look on television, and we saw Black person after Black person after Black person murdered. And we had to acknowledge, it was almost as if the acknowledge, look, I'm a Navy brat. My dad was served in the military. It was like the caskets coming home during Vietnam. The entire nation had to collectively acknowledge there's something wrong here. There's something drastically wrong here. And when that happens, people take to the streets. Action actually comes because our soul is stirred. And then you have that doubled up to an actual election where we have someone who is not fighting for the soul of this nation, someone who's fighting for himself, who's trying to win more than to solve our problems. That's going to create the movement that you've spoken about, that Will was speaking about, because we realize it can't just stop with going, you can't march in the streets and then not vote, because marching in the streets puts the pressure that then makes them listen when you vote. But the vote is what puts them in office and actually gets it moving. So the vote is, it's like marching in the streets is the fuel that we put in the engine, but that vote is the spark that ignites the engine and gets the engine of change really moving. And we have to make sure we utilize that. So for me, the thing that I've learned is, most importantly, especially talking about technology, is that it's not just if you use it, because I think you have a duty and a responsibility to use it. And it's not what you say, but how you say it. The old adage is true. It's not what you say, but how you say it and when. And the time is now, and the how we say it is very important. And I think I'm just going to go back to, again, giving Ashley props about a phenomenal night last night. Michelle Obama, she said it, and we've all used the phrase so many times since she said it. When they go low, we go high. And, you know, I grew up, I always say that I speak respectfully, not because I respect the other person or their beliefs, but because I respect myself. And I'm not going to give anyone a reason to dismiss what I have to say. So my friends ask me, how come you don't feel the level of blowback on social media when you speak out? And I say, because how I say it. When I speak on social media, I'm not going to say anything on social media that I won't say to your face. And more importantly, I'm probably going to say it how I would say it to your face. So people look for the greatest clapback. People look for the greatest gotcha moment. And the problem is that's the going low. That's the how do I get the dig in that makes me sound cool, that makes me sound great. Solve the problem. Don't try and win the argument. Solve the problems. Make sure people understand and you're educating people. And so for me, it's been about, you know, and I'll throw another stat at Will, that Black folks are 10 times more likely to die from gun violence than a white person. And for me, the fact that that's not on everyone's lips is a travesty. So there's so many things that we need to be talking about, and it's just trying to model the conversation to make sure, you know, my friends, and most of them are on the show with me on Station 19, we started this thing online, hashtag 19 for 20, that literally was about 19 ideas or concepts that you need to understand for 2020, 19 for 20. So it's literally about trying to model the conversation and self-education that a lot of our fans are young folks. We want to make sure they understand, look this stuff up, Google this stuff, talk to people, and have this conversation constantly. Keep your voice moving. And most importantly, it all culminates in your vote. Because if you have this big conversation and don't show up, then it was for nothing. You're just talking to hear yourself talk. It all comes down to the vote. That's the biggest action that you can take. So that's been the conversation amongst me and my friends who have a platform. But I just want to remind everybody that if you have a phone or access to the internet, you too have a platform and a duty and a responsibility to be having this conversation and putting a vote out there. And I think common sense says that if you haven't seen the problems facing our nation, there's one man and a woman who are in a position to actually start moving us into the direction of solving them.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. Thanks for using your platform, for reminding us to use our platforms. We have about 10 minutes left in this segment. So what I'd like to do is try to get to each of you with one follow-up question. I will remind our viewers that you can use the chat to post questions, and we'll try to get to those as many as we can throughout the afternoon here. But I'm going to start back with you, Will. You when you spoke, you mentioned your work to make sure that racism was declared a public health emergency. I'm just curious, and also Jason mentioned some of the policies that he was working on. By the way, Jason, we should circulate that to our folks. So let's make sure we get that from you afterwards. Your 19 for 20, we'd love to circulate that to our viewers and to our New Deal leaders. But Will, are there other issues? I know there are other issues you're working on. Do you want to highlight a few other issues that you feel like there's a real chance for movement on at the state and local level right now to address some of these issues?
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And thank you again to Ashley and Jason. That was very powerful and so important. You know, I talked about the resolution declaring racism a public health emergency, directing us to have a plan in each of those areas. That's really important because, you know, if we don't turn this moment into a movement, the moment will pass. And you have to, when the moment passes, and the movement is the plan of action. You know, it was a 63 March for Jobs and Justice. You know, that plan, that you know, systematic step by step. You know, having a example of a plan to eradicate racism from every part of our system. You know, from criminal justice, from environment, from our opportunity gaps in our schools. You have to, that's going to take a while. You don't build something over 401 years and then just snap your fingers. And so I think that's important. So I would urge other states and colleagues, and I know some have, there's been a couple dozen that have taken that action, because I think the urgency is important. Obviously, we have to reimagine public safety. We just passed a landmark use of force bill here in my county where we banned chokeholds and striking individuals who were restrained. We raised the level of when you can use deadly force to making it only when absolutely necessary, not when reasonable. And that has been shown to get at that issue of police violence higher than the Constitution, the Supreme Court-based standard. So those are some of the steps that we have to take. But then we have to pass racial equity legislation. We've also passed every bill that we have in the county starting August 1 will have a racial equity statement, impact statement. Just like you have a fiscal analysis, this bill is going to show us what would this policy do to our diverse population. And we have 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country in Montgomery County, Maryland. And so we need to know how every action we take, every budgetary item we consider will impact that whole population. Because what we're really talking about at the end of the day is robbing people of their human potential. That's what racism, systemic racism does. Obviously, individual racism has a role, but the systems that rob you of the opportunity to achieve what we all want to say is the American dream, the opportunity to have a life better than your parents, to forge forward for your children. That is what racism robs us. So I think we just have to be systemic in our approach. Those are 2 very clear examples. That resolution. We also passed the Crown Act, banning hair discrimination, saying that, as I look at Ashley's beautiful protected curls there, and when I have my little afro here, you know, that I've worked on during COVID, saying that hair discrimination, natural hair discrimination, is race discrimination. You know, that's the Crown Act. That needs to be passed, because this awakening, again, we have to expose the underbelly of what's happened over the course of history here and have a plan in each of these areas. And again, realizing that when we do that, we unlock the potential, the economic activity for all of us in this country. It's not just because it's morally right, it's because it's the right thing to do for our nation.
Thanks so much, Will. And again, thanks for all your leadership. You've been a leader for other New Deal leaders on many of these issues, so we appreciate everything that you're doing on that. Ashley, let me turn back to you to probe a little bit more on the Kamala Harris selection. It was historic, and you talked a little bit about how that affected you and impacted you. How are you seeing that that kind of representation as you're going around the country? What has that done to people around the country in terms of their enthusiasm, and also, you know, what are there things we can expect from the Biden-Harris campaign in terms of policy to reflect that choice?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, I was overwhelmed with emotions of joy. I made a lot of calls that day, the 24-hour, you know, announcement period, and I will tell you, leaders, national leaders, local leaders, activists, everyone was so excited about the opportunity to make history. But most importantly, it's not just about making history. It's about the fact that she's also qualified. We know that when women run for office, they are mistreated, they are targeted, they are demeaned, even when they are qualified. And Kamala Harris is more than qualified. She has had a career that really has made her ready for this moment. She is ready on day one. And so it is just an amazing, awesome experience to see a woman of color put a crack in that ceiling, that glass ceiling, and be overly qualified for the position. I will say our campaign has seen some record number engagements around fundraising, around people volunteering to participate. I mean, just the convention in of itself, you know, being able to have so many people be pulled in last night and see themselves for what America really is, a diverse country that is welcoming to all people, or should be welcoming them, not necessarily under this president, but should be welcoming to all people. I think in terms of policy recommendations, you know, I've been on the campaign now for 2.5 months. Since that time, we have rolled out a new criminal justice reform policy. We have rolled out our Build Back Better policy, one that focuses on being jobs to have things be made in America, a clean energy economy rollout, a caregiving economy, which was historical because no presidential nominee has ever rolled out a policy that focuses on our caregivers. And in COVID, we know how much more important caregivers are in this country, whether it be for young people or older Americans or just folks who need care. We've also rolled out a racial equity policy, and there is more to come. So the vice president picked Senator Kamala Harris because she's qualified. It's also awesome to make history, but the policies that will come will be aligned with what he has done to date and will continue to be representative of what we need to make this country great.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And remind me again, to your really important point about how women, not just of color, but women generally been treated in politics, and then women of color in particular. I think there's a hashtag I've seen on Twitter, "We've got her back" or something. You want to remind us what to use this week in that vein?
So we have our DNC convention tag that we have our back as a C3 organization, and we want to protect them and let them do their work. But I think, you know, the fact that you have organizations out there leading the way, ensuring that we will protect Kamala Harris. We will not let her be mistreated. You know, even when you heard on the first day the way Donald Trump called her nasty, well, listen, Kamala Harris can handle Donald Trump. I am sure of that. So we are ready the next 77 days to get to work, to win, and then to govern.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. We're looking forward to tonight and the rest of the week for the convention program. In just the couple minutes I have left here, Jason, let me turn back to you. I was really struck last night by Michelle Obama's speech. I'm a mother, and she talked kind of as a parent, specifically about the values that we want to instill in our kids. And I think that that's very much tied to how we treat all Americans. And you mentioned your kids, so I'm going to ask you, what are some of those values that you're seeing in the Biden-Harris campaign and that you're instilling in your kids that you think are critical that we make sure that the people understand that's what's at stake in this election?
Look, I can't even underscore how much, how excited my family is. Look, my wife is an Indian immigrant. She was born in New Delhi, moved here when she was 2, grew up here. We met in college. So my kids are Black and Indian. And you want to talk about representation matters. For the 3 little Blindians, my kids, to look up and see a woman who is Black and Indian, and claiming both, not having to choose one or the other. That's the America that we're moving into. That's the America that their generation is about. And the fact that Biden gets that Biden recognizes the talent wherever it is, not just in the old boys network that existed. I mean, that's what the work I do at SAG-AFTRA, that's what I fight for. Is I understand, I live in Hollywood. Representation matters incredibly, but it needs to be balanced by the people behind the scenes, the people who actually have the power to make decisions. That has to have the same diversity that you're putting in front of the camera. Otherwise, the diversity in front of the camera is window dressing at its worst. And the representation still matters, but what gives it teeth is people behind the scenes. And in Kamala being in the VP spot, that's both those in one spot. That's representation that I can see. And I know that there's people actually making decisions that represent the America that my kids are growing up in. So we're excited. And it was the entire convention last night was really moving because of that. You see just how big a tent it is. And that, the values that Biden has always displayed of putting family first, of making sure he makes time. I remember years ago when he was a senator, even before he was vice president, seeing him get that Joe Biden grit in his face when somebody was saying, hey, they kind of were saying, these senators are asking me questions about the war, and they don't know. And he said, do you mean that I have to tell my son Bo? And he got that grit in his voice where I saw a dad who was looking to protect his son. Even though his son was a grown man, you never stop being a dad. And I recognized that. And then I started finding out more about how Joe would walk out of meetings if his kids called because they'd lost their mother at such a young age. And he said, nothing is more important than my kids. And I've seen that reflected in people that I want to have in my life. Shonda Rhimes has on her email, if you're reading this after 7 o'clock, maybe you need to be with your family. There's very little that can't wait until the morning. And understanding what's most important and what we're really fighting for. Joe Biden gets that. He figured out, he knows how big a tent and how diverse this country is and how that's a strength of this country by choosing Kamala Harris. So for me, the values of the Biden-Harris ticket for me, I'm excited beyond belief, and I'm enthusiastic and I'm optimistic. So I'm looking forward to the next few months.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Ashley and Will, just both for being with us today, but also for your champions, the change that you are doing every day. So I want to thank all 3 of you again as we move on to our next segment. So our first 3 speakers touch on some important ideas for reform. And this afternoon, we're going to take a closer look at some of the critical issues where longstanding inequities have kept far too many people from achieving their full potential. COVID-19 has shone a bright spotlight on these issues: small business and entrepreneurship, broadband access, affordable housing. So much needs to be done in the short term to provide support and relief to those who've been affected by COVID. And equally important, we've got to think about how we're going to reimagine and rebuild America in the long term, addressing those inequities head on. So we're grateful to be joined by some policymakers and experts to talk about those three issues today. They're going to share a little bit about what's happening and what's already happening and what can happen to bring about that change. We're going to start today with two folks to talk about entrepreneurship. I want to welcome to the program Philip Gaskin, Vice President for Entrepreneurship for the Ewing, Marion, Kaufman Foundation, where he oversees the foundation's national strategy on eliminating systemic barriers to entrepreneurship and enhancing economic activity through inclusive entrepreneurship. And I also want to welcome NewDEAL leader Stephen Reed. Stephen joined the NewDEAL when he was probate judge in Montgomery County, and we've loved working with him. And we were all so thrilled when last year he made history being elected as Montgomery's first African-American mayor in the city's 200-year history. So welcome to you both. Let me make sure you're on here. Great. Philip, Stephen, excellent. So Philip, let me start with you if that's okay. Sure. What are some of the barriers to entrepreneurs of color, and what can be done to support existing entrepreneurs in the short run, but also spur new entrepreneurial enterprises when we get past COVID?
Sure, thank you, and pleasure to be here with everyone. I am, I think it's important to step back a little bit when we, even pre-COVID, the first thing, the playing field for entrepreneurs of female entrepreneurs, minority entrepreneurs is just not level. That was the case before COVID, and it's far worse now. Between February and April of this year, the number of business owners in the United States declined by just over 3 million, about 3.3 million, the largest drop ever on record. And Black business owners declined by 41%. Latinx business owners suffered a decline of more than 1.1 million. And so we know that communities of color have been impacted by COVID. We've fallen faster, and it will take longer to recover, as it did out of the Great Recession and other times in history. The other problem that we've got is that entrepreneurship has just been flat for decades, right? And so as more and more business activity migrates to large existing businesses, there's been a lot of consolidation. For an entrepreneur, one of the most important factors and needs is capital. So when I look at that geographic shift that I just mentioned regarding capital resources and looking at venture capital, in 2018, the $21 billion in venture capital that was issued went to 5 cities in 4 states. So it's New England area, Northern California, Los Angeles, etc. What about the rest? And only just over 2%, just over 2.2% of that venture capital went to firms with founding teams led by women. Only 1% went to African Americans. And so when you look at that from a geographic perspective, entrepreneurs trying to get capital, when you look at the most money in businesses is going into corporations to inspire corporate growth, that's perpetuating monopolies. It's not perpetuating small business growth. It's not helping entrepreneurs. And so what I would like to see is governments at every level focus on these type of issues of capital, of distribution, of access, of equity. And that's a lot there. That's my intro. I'll start there, and I certainly can expand on anything you'd like.
Excellent. Yeah, actually, can you talk a little bit more about the capital piece? Are you seeing anything, are you seeing promising approaches anywhere where people are making a difference on that?
Well, I am. I think the last 4 months has definitely brought out what we've already known. The inequities are there. Many of us have known that, but for others, it's really brought it to light, which is a positive. One of the things that we have done, take philanthropy first, is look at the credit system. Is a challenge. The financial system is a challenge, and I'll tell just a quick story. When I was a kid in South Central Los Angeles, I used to go everywhere with my father. We used to just go everywhere when I was a kid, and one place that we always used to go was the bank. But I noticed we went to a lot of different banks, and finally one day I said to Dad, "Why are we going so many different banks. He said, son, I'll tell you when you grow up. Turns out it took him 4 years to get a loan because of the zip code we lived in, because the credit score he had was a tad too low, because the color of his skin, on and on and on. And those things are playing out still today. They're playing out in cities, in urban edge, in suburbia, and even in rural as well. And so one of the things that we've looked at is how do we test out a new model, a mechanism of getting capital to entrepreneurs in underrepresented populations. It's called our Capital Access Lab, where we have just announced 3 weeks ago investing in 5 funds, 3 of which are 5 funds, some led by people of color, some led by women, all sending money and investing in entrepreneurs that are in these underrepresented populations. And so it's a revenue-based financing model. We're going to study it, see how it works, and hopefully we'll have more investors in that. Rockefeller Foundation came in as an investor in this as well. And it's philanthropy, looking how do we use our granting capability to start new systems that can help get resources to entrepreneurs.
That's fantastic. I'm going to turn to Mayor Reed, but if we have time, I may come back to you with another question.
Sure.
Philip, thank you. So Mayor, so great to see you as always. And I'm just glad you could be here to talk a little bit about, you in Montgomery turned pretty quickly to understanding that your small business folks needed support in your city. You stood up an economic impact fund that's done a number of different initiatives to try to help on the short term. I'd love to hear some of that about what you've been doing, as well as what you're thinking more longer term to make sure that there's capital and support for entrepreneurs in your city.
Sure, Debbie, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on with all the NewDEAL leaders and many of our partners as well. This year has been very unique for me. Not only is it my first year in office as mayor, but obviously we're dealing with the impact of a once-in-a-century global pandemic. And that has certainly changed some of our plans that we had on the map for our first year in office. And many of those were around investing in our entrepreneurship and investing in minority and Black-owned businesses, which have been traditionally overlooked, not only here in the city, but in our state government practices as well. And so because of the pandemic, we had to stand up an economic impact task force, which we brought together our city and county leaders along with private industry leaders to assess where the needs were for our small businesses. How could we help them, and how could we address some of the challenges that they had? And what we did was we kind of pulled together a recovery fund, and we brought in consultants and professionals to really identify how to assist those small businesses with their SBA loans, how to help them get applications in for PPP loans and other type of instruments that were out there. And what we found was that many of our businesses not only did not have the capital to last more than 1 or 2 pay periods, but they didn't have the understanding of how to go about filing for some of the basic programs that were out there through the Small Business Administration. So we reached out to our small business, our regional administrator, Ashley Bell, here in the Southeast, and we held a phone call. We had T.I. on the phone. We had John Hope Bryant on the phone. We had many others talking about programs that were going on nationally, and we pulled in our minority business community to try to get them a macro understanding of what was out there at that time. But what we also did was we wanted to make sure that through our professionals and consultants that we were able to help them through the loan process, and we were able to identify what some of their issues were. And so as we kind of went through the SBA process and found out what was in the first stimulus package, what was available, and what wasn't, we came to understand that we would have to start our own local fund. And so we started a local fund here. We raised almost $500,000, with about 82% of that going to minority and Black-owned businesses. Many of those were mom and pop shops, retail establishments, also barbershops and beauty salons, because we understand these are the backbones of our economy. We understand that these businesses really fortify all the economic development work and all of the home run projects that we go after, because they are employing many people, not only in this community, but through the surrounding communities as well. The unfortunate part about that is often those jobs are not paying the same level of wages that our traditional jobs are. So we are a service and manufacturing based town. More so, our economy is backed by the government because we are the state capital of Alabama. So when we juxtapose that versus the private interest that we have, we're lacking. And we're lacking because we haven't had the opportunities for Black businesses to gain access to capital, to have traditional partnerships with our financial institutions. And I've been one who has challenged that as a member of our advisory board for Trustmark Bank here in Montgomery. The bad part about that is many of our banks still only have the basic minimums that they're doing when it comes to their CRA activities. And we want to make sure that our banks are being more proactive here. And so I've tried to not only do that with the bank board that I serve on, but also through the bank boards that hold city business accounts. We want to make sure that they are acting in the best interest of this community, in particular those businesses and those populations which have been overlooked. And when we think about kind of where we are from an unemployment standpoint, we know that Black unemployment is roughly double that of whites. We know that our home ownership has been wiped out, and we're back now down to 50-year lows in home ownership. And we also understand that the wealth in Black households is only about 1/10 that of white households. So we have to be more intentional and more deliberate in things that we're doing, in my opinion, from the policymaking level at the local, state, and national levels. And so often we talk about equality, but we don't talk enough about equity. And equity means that we have to make up for some of the ground and for some of the disadvantages that have been in businesses, in those entrepreneurs, in their ability to scale their ideas and in their ability to scale their products that they have. And when we think about those areas from a regional standpoint, the South still lags behind, even more so than other parts of the country. So we know that we have a lot of work to do by tapping our venture capital community, by talking to angel investors, and by trying to get more minority and Black entrepreneurs in front of them, and by really challenging them to invest into some of the communities that they have traditionally overlooked. And so we want to make sure that as we try to help all of our communities throughout this pandemic, that we understand the disproportionate impact that it has on Black businesses, and that we do some things deliberately that will help try to level the playing field and hopefully try to get some progress back into that area of Black businesses and those that have been traditionally left behind.
Great, thanks so much, Mayor. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes. Let me see if I can get a question in here for each of you. Philip, I actually had a question come in from the audience I'd like to read to you to start, Philip. For many state and local policymakers, it may seem easier to focus on recruiting existing businesses to come to their communities rather investing in entrepreneurs. Stephen touched on this a little bit. Why is it important for policymakers to make new business creation a priority?
Thank you, because wonderful question, because the backbone of the economy is on small business. Almost 50% of the economy of the small businesses, the entrepreneurial spirit, and we can't lose that. As I said before, entrepreneurship has been stagnant. So it's not necessarily the policy, make policies on the size of the business, but on the age of the business. Where are they in the cycle, and why is it important to provide entrepreneurs, small business owners, that support at the beginning arc of the business to make sure that they have the tools and the resources necessary to withstand a pandemic period to withstand other things. And so, and building off the mayor mentioned is what are those other entrepreneur-friendly policies? And the ones that he mentioned are fantastic, and building on those at the state level, at the federal level. And we have a 4-point plan. It's called America's New Business Plan. That's our policy statement. Folks can go to startusupnow.org. And it's a plan that we put together from a bipartisan perspective with feedback, working with the consulting firm that did the outreach. It's a 4-point plan: knowledge, opportunity, support, and funding, giving tangible things at the local, federal, and state level that we suggest from an entrepreneur policy perspective would be certainly helpful for entrepreneurs. Happy to please, everyone can take a look at that and give us feedback. We did a supplement, a COVID-related supplement on it as well, because America's New Business Plan we released last year did a supplement called Rebuilding Better, which speaks a little bit more specifically to this time period.
That's fantastic, Philip. Thank you so much. We'd love to circulate that report to our leaders around the country, so we'll make sure we get that from you and do that. So important. Mayor, let me finish with a question for you on this section. I know that we often spend our time talking about what state and local leaders can do, so that's what we're a network of, but you both kind of mentioned the funding aspect. So I want to ask you, Steve, and it is convention week, right? So we've got the Biden-Harris administration coming in, hopefully. So if there's one thing or two things you need from the federal government, Stephen, to be able to make some of these things happen in Montgomery, what are those?
Well, I think certainly we need greater access to capital for our small businesses, in particular for our Black businesses. We have to provide more incentive for banks and financial institutions to partner not only with private sector industries in terms of partnerships and loans, but also to make sure that they're working with state and local governments to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to bring in a more fair and opportunistic procurement process. Many of the opportunities that we're seeing right now are the benefit of companies that got their opportunities with government. And it's hard to get your foot in the door in most governments at any level. And if we can see some of those opportunities promoted, I think, from a Biden-Harris administration, then we can see a return to some of the progress that we saw prior to the recession. And I believe if we do that, then our economy will be stronger. I think our communities will be stronger, and we'll see better output, not only in terms from an economic standpoint, but in terms of community and entrepreneurial ideas. It's going to make this country better if more minority businesses and more Black-owned businesses in particular have access to capital, and they're getting the partnerships and they're getting the loans from financial institutions that they have not been getting over the last 10 to 20 years.
That's fantastic. Thank you both so much, really. And I should mention that the New Deal Forum, our sister organization, we have a Renewing America task force that we have launched in the light of COVID that will both be looking at areas that we need to work on to have an economic recovery after COVID, but also to address some of these longstanding inequities, and entrepreneurship will be one of those. So we hope we can have you both back to talk more about this in the future. Thank you.
Just to say, so proud of the work Mayor Reed is doing in a fabulous city of Montgomery, Alabama. I can't wait to get back down there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, both so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Another area where we have seen disparities in access highlighted and exacerbated by COVID-19 has been in the access to broadband, which is critical as we notice so many things from distance learning to working remotely. So we're very pleased to have with us two leaders to talk about broadband access, Michigan Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist and Comcast NBC Universal Dalila Wilson-Scott. I'm going to throw you a little bit of a wrench, Dalila, and ask you to go first if you don't mind. We're so happy to have you. Let me just introduce you a little bit here. Dalila is the Senior Vice President of Community Impact for Comcast and the President of Comcast NBC Universal Foundation, where she leads the company's effort to extend the reach and impact of philanthropic partnerships, as well as to improve the communities and lives of the residents in which they work. She's been named one of the most powerful women in business by Black Enterprise and an innovative rising star for building communities by Forbes magazine. So Dalila, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Debbie, for having me. It's an honor to be here with you and the New Deal leaders. Talk about broadband access. Also, special shout out to Michigan Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist. I think he's joined now for all the work and his leadership and the efforts to close the digital divide in his home state. And I know many New Deal leaders have been a part of that as well. I mean, what I'll say is at Comcast, we've been focused on this issue for over a decade now. And I think given where we are with the pandemic, the urgency has definitely become clear for everyone. We also know that it's an issue that's large enough and vast enough that it will take many stakeholders to come together. And that's probably true for most of the issues that you're discussing today, in fact. But most of us know, I mean, while we would all love to be together in Milwaukee, the fact of the matter is, despite our varied backgrounds, all of us sit in a place of privilege where we do have broadband access. We know that about 73% of Americans do, but when we look at communities of color, probably 61% of Hispanics, 66% of African Americans, and you can cut and slice that a number of different ways when you look at socioeconomic data. But we know that if you don't have basic access to broadband internet, you basically cannot be on a strong path to economic mobility. So when we think about broadband access, that's sort of the area of focus for us when it comes to economic justice. And we know that access disproportionately affects communities of color. Essentially, there are three barriers that those of us in this space focus on. Number one, of course, is the cost and affordability of the internet. Second, being devices and equipment. And finally, what I would say is the most critical is digital literacy, awareness, and skills. And so there's a piece of that that's about the power of basic connectivity. Most people, you know, when you think of someone who is not connected as of today, there are a number of different reasons for that person not being connected. Is there a trust factor? You know, do they believe that most of the resources they're trying to access are possible from a smartphone or other ways, or community centers, much of which has been shut off due to COVID in terms of access to other resources. So first, there's just that piece. But then once you are connected, if we really want to start somebody on a path to economic mobility, it's really about access to qualified skills and training. We just heard Mayor Reed talk about entrepreneurship, especially entrepreneurship in communities of color. There's no industry that you can enter today without having some level of technological and technical skill sets. And we know a lot of that process begins when you start on the internet. You need the internet to apply for a job, to attend school, to even get to work for those of us that are able to work from home. So it is definitely critical. I think even Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist talked about, you know, when most of us here don't have internet, it's merely an inconvenience, but we know how to get it back. For those that are disconnected, you're being shut off from way too many doors.
Great, thanks so much, Dalila. I want to come back to you a little bit to talk about some of the work you guys, great work you've been doing. I know you were early on in your expansion of your Internet Essentials to get people connected, and I know that there's a number of cities you've been working with to try to increase access I'd like to hear about in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and first introduce Lieutenant Gilchrist, let him make some remarks, and then we'll come back. So Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist, welcome. As many people may know, Lieutenant Governor is elected in 2018 in Michigan. He has made, since being elected, he's made equality, justice, and harnessing technology key priorities. Before public service, he worked as a software engineer, then in social and new media, and finally actually served as the first director ever of innovation and emerging technology for the city of Detroit. So he has a long-standing background in technology to help us tackle this issue. We're very pleased that the Lieutenant Governor is also one of the co-chairs of our New Deal Forum Renewing America Task Force. So Lieutenant Governor, let me ask you, why is broadband so important, and what are you doing to tackle the barriers to connectivity in your state?
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. And I want to thank everyone on this panel for your participation and for the leadership that you show in your respective realms to connect our people. And that's really what this is all about. We are all able to exercise more of our full potential when we are better connected as communities. That means when we're connected relationally, as well as when we are connected to one another online. I want to tell a story about why this is so important to me. So you heard in my bio, yes, I'm an engineer by training. I got my first computer when I was 5 years old, became the first kid on my block on the east side of Detroit to get a computer when my grandma said that her baby needed to have a computer. And I fell in love with that thing and took it apart and put it together and did all kinds of crazy stuff with it. But my first job when I was 16 was actually building computers. I got a chance to work with a young guy who was a PC tech at General Motors who built computers as a side hustle. And I worked with him and built the first 5 computers I ever made with my own hands in his living room. And we installed them at a community center, a recreation center on the west side of Detroit. And I got a chance to teach a class at that rec center about how to use computers on the computers that I built. And I met a little girl named April who was 8 at the time. And I got a chance to show her the internet for the first time. And this was 98, y'all, so I'm dated a little bit. So we were using the search engine Alta Vista. And April typed in Tiger. And the first search result was something about the Detroit Tigers, our hometown baseball team, and that was great. But the second search result was a picture of a Bengal tiger. And she asked me if that tiger was at the Detroit Zoo. And I said, no, April, that tiger is not at the zoo. That tiger is in India on the other side of the world. And I saw this little girl's eyes almost pop out of her head. Her imagination exploded. She recognized that she could be connected to information and ideas that were not in Detroit because of this thing called the internet. That potential that was unlocked in her. I don't know what she went on in life to do, but I know that she had a bigger idea about what her future could be because she saw the internet and was connected to it. That's something that every person in every community deserves. And we have to break down the barriers that stand between our people and connection. So you heard Dalila speak to a few of those, whether it's affordability, whether it is digital literacy, whether it is, I want to speak about another one that's critically important, especially in a state like Michigan, and that is access and build out. There are still parts of our state where the internet is not yet within reach for people, whether those are in some of our more rural parts of our state, whether that is in our tribal nations and other parts of the state. And we have to think about what it will take from a policy and an infrastructure perspective to enable the build out so that this internet can reach our people. There also may be a potential to look for new business models and new delivery mechanisms. And we've seen some important innovation from that for places like Northern Michigan University in the Upper Peninsula that are using educational broadband inspection to provide wireless broadband internet access to the Upper Peninsula and some parts of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. This is a field that is ripe with opportunity. And it's a field where everybody can be a winner. And so I'm excited to work alongside not only my NewDEAL colleagues to think of ideas, but also to work with industry experts, community leaders, and also just people who are hungry for connection and the potential that it enables. And we have an opportunity to be the generation that fully connects our people. Just like generations before us, our communities were connected with roads. Our communities were connected with railroads. Now our communities need to be connected online because that will unlock the next generation of entrepreneurs, of innovators, of decision making that's able to happen in a new way, and I think a more rich way because we will be a connected people. That's my ambition as Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, to have Michigan be the first state that truly connects all of its people. And I'm looking forward to working with all of you to make that a reality. So thank you all for your leadership, your perspective, and your ideas.
Thanks so much, Lieutenant Governor. I'm going to turn to Dalila, back to Dalila with a question, and then time permitting, I'm going to come back to you with a question as well. But Dalila, Lieutenant Governor just mentioned bringing those stakeholders together, public and private sector. And again, I know that Comcast has done a really great job of working with cities around the country to partner to try to expand access. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing and what other state and local leaders might learn from those partnerships?
Sure. When it's 2011 when we launched our Internet Essentials program, and we're proud to say now it's the country's largest broadband internet adoption program. And basically through that program, we work with government, elected leaders, community leaders, faith-based community, nonprofit organizations, libraries, school districts, to really come together to find out the best way to tackle some of the barriers that we've talked about to date. And so as we approached back to school, and even starting back in March, we've worked with 70 plus school districts and cities around the country to help close this divide and get more kids connected. Most recently in Philadelphia, we work with a series of philanthropic partners, the city, the school district, charter school leadership, to make sure there's a path to connect 35,000 families throughout the city of Philadelphia that are attending public school. We have a similar partnership in Chicago and many other cities across the country. And I think, again, with the problem this large and that has so many different impacts in the city, you need to have this many stakeholders at the table to make it work. Also, we think what's great about having broadband internet in the home, as well as starting with the child in public school, in many of these situations, the home is connected, right, for 12 months a year. So when you have adults in the home, when you have others in the home that could benefit from that access and speak to some of the aspiration that Lieutenant Governor was just addressing, I mean, that's really the power of the internet. In these past few years, we've been able to connect 8 million people to the internet. And, they have all been able to benefit from that connection. And it started with something very simple, but the truth is it creates this path to exploration that definitely can help someone along the way, whether it's work, education, and other resources. So we're glad to have as many partners as we do. We count 10,000 to date and counting to really bring this service to more and more people.
Thank you so much for that. Lieutenant Governor, you talked a little bit about some of the efforts at the state level, which are super important. As I asked the last panelist, this is the convention week, so I'd be remiss to not ask you what you need from a Biden-Harris administration after Election Day. What can the federal government best do to support your efforts at the state and the local level to try to expand connectivity?
Well, this is the most important infrastructure investment that we can make as a people and as society. And I'm really proud that as one of the core tenets of the Biden-Harris Build Back Better agenda for racial equity, that an investment in broadband that is particularly focused and weighted upon ensuring access, connectivity, and affordability in Black, Brown, and other communities of color is a priority plank in that agenda. So I was excited to see that. And certainly we need to see those sorts of things reflected in investment choices at the state level. Here in the state of Michigan, Governor Gretchen Whitmer and I ran on a platform of infrastructure investment, whether that was water infrastructure, where you are doing water infrastructure upgrades. You have an opportunity to also connect communities to the internet. And so we've been making those investments over time. And I also want to speak to something that I think is really critical. The internet access problem has been urgent for a long time. This was like actually the first research project I did when I was in college, looking at internet gaps on the east side of Detroit. Activity challenges exacerbated not only in the education,
Lieutenant Governor, I think we're losing
but also
you. You're coming in.
I'm on the freeway, y'all.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, connectivity. It's apropos, right, of our conversation. So let's see. I'll give you one more shot there to see if it's a little bit better.
I'm on the freeway. I apologize.
That's okay. Yeah. Actually,
so now,
I think I'm going to let Dalila finish up this this question, if you don't mind, just because you're coming in and out. So, Dalila, do you have thoughts on how the federal government can both help the what needs to happen around the country?
Just to piggyback on what the Lieutenant Governor was just saying, is that this problem has been urgent for quite some time, and it's a good thing that so many more people are bringing urgency to it in terms of the pace, the funding, how this will happen, and how we can be more efficient about it. But I do think, a lot of the bills and discussion happening at the federal table on how we get broadband to more people in and outside of urban markets is definitely, we have to keep this front and center. Once COVID is behind us and we know we're going to a new normal, I do hope that people continue to press on the urgency for this issue at federal, state, and local levels.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to thank you both. As you both kind of noted, obviously, some of the changes that have happened, working from home, distance learning, whether or not kids are back in school, this is going to be an ongoing issue. So this is something that the task force that the Lieutenant Governor co-chairs, our Renewing America Task Force, will continue to look at, both in terms of the short-term needs around COVID, but also the longer-term issues. So I want to thank you both so much for being with us, and I know that we'll continue to talk to you going forward about great ideas around the country. So thank you both so very much.
Thank you for having us, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you so much. We're going to close today with a conversation about disparities in housing. Our task force I keep referencing actually did a report recently, and in those recommendations we noted that Black Americans are twice as likely to rent as white households and pay significantly more of their income toward housing. People of color are also subject to much higher rates of evictions, which we fear will only be increasing as many of the local eviction moratoriums that were put in place because of COVID as they are about to expire. So we're thrilled to have two leaders to help us talk about this issue, housing issue. I'm going to introduce both of them now and then turn to one. First, let me welcome Paraag Sarva. He is the CEO of Rhino and co-founder. I'm sorry, he was before that. He was a real estate technology. He worked for a real estate technology company focused on making renting easier. He served also as a City Hall policy advisor to Michael Bloomberg. We've been very lucky to partner with Rhino to promote Renter's Choice, which was first introduced by New Deal leader P.G. Sittenfeld in Cincinnati to replace upfront costs paid by renters with low-cost alternatives. We will also be hearing from Mayor Lucas of Kansas City. Mayor Lucas was elected last August after serving for quite some time on the city council. And as in both of those roles, he made affordable housing a priority, including creating and chairing the city's special committee on housing. He has discussed, he's himself experienced housing challenges as a child, and we're looking forward to hearing both of them about their work. I am hoping, Paraag, that you wouldn't mind if I put you on the spot to go first. Mayor Lucas will be joining us in just a minute. But if I could turn to you, would love to hear from you about how important it is for the private and public sector to get together to address really what is a looming housing crisis in this country.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be with you today and happy to go first. To take that question straight off, I think, what we're seeing was important in January 2020. It was important in February 2020. And now as you accelerate through the last 5 to 6 months, I can't imagine what is more important than what we're seeing unfold in front of us with respect to housing. It's one of the central pillars of society. And really, my view has been that it's going to take everyone doing something to contribute to solving this challenge. There's no one party, whether it's a private company or whether it's a city or state or federal entity, that is going to have the magic bullet. And that's why we've been such strong advocates for what we feel is a really important and meaningful contribution to that broader story of solving or thinking we can work towards solving, this crisis. What we've done, and thank you for referencing the good work we've done with Councilmember P.G. Sittenfeld and Mayor Cranley in Cincinnati, is passing the first ever in the nation Renter's Choice Law earlier this year. And we think that's a remarkable start. I'm very, very encouraged by the support we have from lawmakers across the country, including places like Philadelphia, Atlanta, and even the state of California, where we are helping accelerate education and awareness for how things like technology and the private sector can really, truly just open up choice for people and give them more opportunity to do things in a new way, which guess what? Brings down and helps level the playing field a little bit more for everyone.
Paraag, again, Renter's Choice has been a great option for people who are looking to get into housing. What are some of the other tools that you've been looking at to try to make renting more affordable?
Yeah, sure. I think that's really what it comes down to, is it's thinking about ways that we can update systems. So real estate is one of the oldest industries out there, and we all know and appreciate, why that's the case. I think that's really what started with us as an early opportunity for thinking about where technology can make an impact. And even going back to, some of the fundamentals about the way leasing is done, security deposits and what we do in terms of creating an insurance alternative that's more affordable is an important point, but there's lots of other opportunities as you think about what that experience is like and how people traditionally think about a relationship with a landlord or a property manager or a property and what they need to give that resident. And so I think even things like Wi-Fi connectivity communities or planned communities, it is such a powerful thing, especially as you think about going into the fall. I have 2 kids that are going back to school now, and my guess is as good as anybody's that they may very well be homeschooled in the fall. So how many home renters have, the means to provide internet connectivity to their classrooms every day? The infrastructure investments in that, I think, is also just one other really great and important example for how to start leveling the playing field a little bit.
Thanks so much, Paraag, and I may come back to you at the end here. I want to welcome Mayor Quinton Lucas, who's joining us from Kansas, great city of Kansas City. Mayor, I introduced you a little earlier before you hopped on, so I won't repeat that, but I just want to welcome you and ask you, I know that housing, as I had mentioned to folks, had been a real priority of yours back from the time you've been on the city council and in your own life personally, and obviously with COVID, we're experiencing such a exasperation of what was already a difficult issue around affordable housing. So tell us what's going on in Kansas City and some of the ways you're trying to address this.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for making the opportunity for me to visit with all of you. It is a busy time and a complex time in Kansas City, showing the various issues with which we deal in American City. I have a group of anti-mask activists that are making noise near City Hall. I have criminal reform issues I was just talking to the City Council about, trying to eliminate arrests for parking tickets. But I think fundamentally all of them, criminal justice reform, our healthcare response, all of those relate to the communities we build, the housing developments that we've created, and the fact that people who have stable housing often have stable health care, often can have opportunities to not be negatively impacted by violent crime. And that's the type of situation we're trying to build and create in Kansas City. I was elected to the City Council in 2015. In 2015, we saw that we had an incredible housing crisis where our affordability, like a lot of other cities, was becoming more in question, where we saw that we had a number of issues where we're providing tax incentives to high income, expensive developments, but not to working class people in our city. That led us to create a housing committee of the City Council. It doesn't seem like the world's biggest step, but sometimes even just talking about something matters a lot. And then as I went through my years of working on housing, I realized, well, gosh, we're putting no funding into it, and we're kind of leaving it as a backwater type department. That's why when I was lucky enough to get elected mayor, I ran on a few key goals, one of which was creating a tenants' Bill of Rights. And it came to me from an advocacy group, so I won't take credit for it. I just carried it through on the legislative side, making sure that in landlord-tenant relations, tenants had an opportunity to know what their rights were. They had an opportunity to know that they would have an advocate working with them at City Hall. And most importantly, they would know that no matter the expense of the housing, that they were entitled to basic human dignity in connection with their housing. I became mayor about a year ago, and what a year it's been, but on my first night as mayor, I actually stayed in a residential housing complex where there had been many complaints about our out-of-state and frankly our out-of-country landlord. And I saw a lot of the conditions and squalor that people were living in at the time. Indeed, I grew up knowing my own troubles with housing. I knew that the implied warranty of habitability is only so useful if you're never actually going to file a legal action. I learned that being homeless isn't something that is necessarily a permanent state, but it was transitory for us. We came in and out of homelessness depending on what my mom's wages were and what our opportunities were. And I saw that legislatively there are ways that we need to have more answers in connection with these issues. I'm glad that in November of 2019, we were able to pass the Housing Bill of Rights, the Tenants Bill of Rights. And then the next question became something that every mayor, governor, anyone else is dealing with, which is, where's the money, right? How do you actually find the funding to support many of these causes? One of it is required to be creative, is us making sure that we're looking at programs like parcel-to-parcel linkages when we're doing economic development, to make sure that we're using land development fees to help inspire our development. But importantly, this. Every year, Kansas City, Missouri receives millions of dollars a year from federal housing authorities in connection with the provision of low-income housing. The mayor in our city, me, appoints a lot of the officials and the commissioners who are on those boards. but are we doing enough to actually tie good development with our affordable housing policies each time? In too many cases, the answer is no. And then we see all of the problems that are perpetuated based upon it. As mayor, probably my next year goal was going to be finding money to support those efforts, which has become a bit more challenging over the last 6 months, but also actually just making sure we're being smart with policy, making sure that when we're handing out housing vouchers to landlords, by the way, not to individuals, when we're working with renters and others, that we're actually seeing that they follow our Housing Bill of Rights, to make sure that we're looking to encourage new development on public transit lines. In Kansas City, I'm proud of the fact that during my year as mayor, we have passed an initiative for zero fare transit and actually created funding for it. So the buses right now in Kansas City, if you were to catch them, are free. It's realizing that all of those things connect to housing that's most important for us, and it's making sure that you have a housing first initiative, not making it something that's just on the back end of things. It's very easy in local government, and state and federal, to say we have other goals. At the local level, potholes and police. At the state level, perhaps it's collection of taxes. On the federal level, it's the Department of Defense and others. But I say if you limit yourself on what those are, then you're never looking at the amount of change you can make in your communities. And not perpetuating the gross inequalities we see as a result of redlining, not perpetuating the inequalities that we see each day from the lack of opportunity in our country. That's what we're doing in Kansas City. I'm proud of it, but I know we have a great deal more work to do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mayor. Let me stick with you for one question. You touched on the homelessness as well as the housing issue. I know that you had done some work specifically around the homelessness around COVID and their safety. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's going?
One of the first things we did when we issued a stay-at-home order was realizing that there were going to be very real and significant challenges as it relates to where do people go in any number of situations. Let's think about the broad variety of them. The first is, where do people go when we're telling shelters and other domestic violence, homeless shelters, etc., that you can only take so many people, that you have to maintain adequate social distancing? So we knew that we needed to provide more support, and we started renting hotels, frankly, before we had any federal money or any other type of money to help us. The other thing that we saw was essential was, yeah, you can tell people that they need to quarantine, but again, if they have nowhere to go, then what are you doing? You're sending people back to homeless camps, etc. And we also saw that we needed to invest in true community organizing. Unfortunately, like a lot of other jurisdictions, we have a number of folks who are unhoused, but who do not have an interest in going into an institutional structure today, next week, or maybe even next month. And so our work was, how do we make sure we're still reaching those groups? How do we make sure that we're still getting testing to those groups to stop a broad spread of a lot of folks that may be immunocompromised and may not even know it? And so we spent a good amount of money and interest and energy from our local government side and making sure that we were acquiring more properties so that we could actually have people housed. We also made sure that we were working with every shelter and every community in our city to ensure that folks would have a place to stay if they were to come up unhoused during the process. But then there's this other important point, which I think is sometimes under-discussed, which is we made sure that folks who were on the cusp of homelessness, those folks who needed some level of rental assistance, were in a position where during COVID-19, not only were there not evictions being done, but we were making sure that we could give them some level of eviction funding relief. Knowing that those eviction dates would come, and indeed in my state already have, we wanted to make sure that folks weren't 5 months behind and thus so behind in their bills before they had a chance to make a difference. I think all of those have been positive steps for our community.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mayor. Let me turn back to Paraag for a final question. We talked a lot about COVID, and I was asking questions kind of about the short term. I'd love to ask you a question about, longer term, what you're seeing in terms of our ability to create enough affordable housing for that we're going to need in this country over the long haul once we get past this initial kind of emergency. What are your thoughts on that, Paraag?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important to focus on the long term, and I fully appreciate, as does everybody else, what's happening right now in the short term. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's really going to come from the 101 different ways that every participant can step up. I think renter's choice, as we've talked about earlier today, is just the beginning, and I think the speed at which that's going to accelerate is going to pick up, and I think that what we'll see is the cities across the country will remain important, interesting places that people want to live. And once we start looking past and feel a little bit more confident that we're, through the near term, a lot of the initiatives that people start focusing on are going to refocus again on the next 10 or 20 or 50 years. It is going to be a freight train type effort. It is not something that's going to happen overnight. I think the mayor has talked about a lot of things that are happening right now, but even in the longer term, it's going to take multiple levels at the city, state, and federal level to come up with a variety of techniques that are going to make incremental efforts to address this issue.
And Paraag, finally, is there anything in particular from the federal government you'll be looking for in the coming months?
I think just continuing to understand that this is a real ongoing challenge for every American. It is a disproportionate impact. The further down you go on the socioeconomic scale, it's a very important thing to note about what's happening as a result of the current crisis. And we definitely need support from the federal government and other levels of government to pitch in and do something and continue to support that and recognize that. It is not an even impact across every type of American and every economic level out there. And we really need to start getting serious about what are those kind of past the next 3 to 6 months, what's the next 12 to 18 months going to look like to bring everybody up, out of what's been happening just over the last 6 months.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you, Paraag, and Mayor Lucas, for you. I hope that, thank you for your efforts, both in the short term and the long term. And I'm just going to refer people back one last time to the New Deal Forum's recent report and recommendations on housing, which has some great ideas on both short and long term, and that can be found at www.newdealforum.org. So I hope you'll check that out. So again, as I bring this program to the close, I just want to thank all the speakers who joined us today on this critically important topic. So many people emphasized the challenges we're facing in these communities of color are not new. However, COVID has certainly highlighted and exacerbated them, and we have both an opportunity and a responsibility to make sure that these critical issues are addressed going forward. We look forward to doing that. The New Deal is committed to partnering with the kinds of leaders, New Deal leaders, and other private sector leaders who are on this call, and many others, and all of you who are joining us today. So we look forward to that, and we also look forward, of course, to a Biden-Harris administration joining us to address these issues in the future. With that, let me just again say thank you. I hope you will join us tomorrow for our final convention program in the road to November, which will take place at 2 o'clock Eastern tomorrow. In the meantime, thanks again. Have a great day.